from. I hope that you have had like a good Saturday. If any events have happened, that they've been fun. We're going to give everybody approximately about like 1 or 2 more minutes to start showing up, and then we will begin the presentation. For those of you that are just joining us, happy Saturday. We'll get started in about 1 to 2 minutes. Welcome to those of you who are joining us. We'll get started in just about 1 minute. All right, cool. Let's get started. So good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're coming in from. Thank you so much for tuning into this webinar today. My name is Amanda, and I'm one of the advisors with CollegeAdvisor, which is a company that helps students starting out from a young age all the way up until their senior year of high school apply to colleges and get into their dream schools. Today, what we're going to be talking about is the SAT and the ACT, which are the standardized tests for college admissions. And we'll demystify what those tests actually are, how you can prepare for them, and what impact they have on college admissions. But before that, a little bit about myself. So as I mentioned, my name is Amanda. I am a senior advisor at CollegeAdvisor, and I've worked with plenty of different students, helping them apply and get into their dream schools. I'm also the manager of the interview coaching team at CollegeAdvisor. So I lead a group of about 10 different advisors who help students prepare and nail their college interviews, which is one part of the admission cycle. I'm a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I got my bachelor's there in 2020 in electrical engineering and computer science. And when I'm not working with CollegeAdvisor, I'm currently pursuing my master's degree at MIT in cybersecurity. So at any point today, if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A. The chat is closed, so you're not going to be allowed to use the chat. But any questions that you have about any of the material that I go over, feel free to put in the Q&A. And then for the second half of our webinar tonight, we will go through those questions and get them answered for you guys. All right, so to start off with, what is the SAT and the ACT? So what they basically are standardized tests that are a part of your college applications that get submitted to the admissions committees at the different universities that you apply to. And I emphasize part of your application. They are not a make or break to your application. They are only part of your application. The SAT specifically has a reading section that is focused on reading comprehension, a grammar section. They call that the writing section, but it's really grammar, focusing on rules of grammar. And then 2 math sections. One is with a calculator and one is without a calculator. And there's also an optional essay in the SAT. And then the ACT has a reading section, a grammar section, a math section, and a science section, and as well as an optional essay. As far as the scoring, each of the sections have their own score. So you will get a separate score in the SAT for your reading, writing combined, and your math combined. And in the ACT, you'll get a separate score for your reading, your writing, your math, and your science. And altogether, a perfect score on the ACT will be a 36 combined, and a perfect score on the SAT will be a 1600. But most colleges actually don't necessarily require you to only submit one score from one test. They actually can do what's called super scoring, which is taking your highest score of all the different sections of the test that you submit, whether it's the SAT or the ACT, and actually consider your highest score in each of the sections when evaluating your score on that exam in your admissions profile, even if different sections had the highest score during different exams that you took. Note they cannot super score both the ACT and the SAT together. Like they can't say, you have a 36 in math on the ACT and you have an 800 on reading, writing in the SAT. They can't do that, but they can super score across like 3 different tests that you took for the ACT and 2 different tests for the SAT, whichever has the best of each of those different sections. So you might be wondering, it seems to be a part of my admissions profile. How can I prepare to do well on this test? So there is an official practice book from College Board or the ACT organization. I took the SAT, so I'm more familiar with that. And with College Board, it's called the official Blue Book. So if you look up College Board SAT Blue Book, you will be able to find that. And it has all the different sections and information about how you can prepare for those sections, as well as real practice tests that were actually generated by the College Board or the ACT organization. And the reason why I emphasize that is because there are so many different brands of books out there, like the Princeton Review and Kaplan, that you can use to take practice tests. But if the SAT or ACT changes, like the way that they ask a question or the level of difficulty of the questions in 1 year, those books might not necessarily reflect that update. But any books coming from the actual College Board organization or the actual ACT organization will reflect those changes. So that's your ground source of truth. And that's why I recommend those books. When you are taking the practice tests in those books, I highly, highly encourage you to stimulate the same testing environment that you would have when you're at your local high school taking the actual exam. Because if you're on a computer just doing practice tests, then your mind might be tempted to look up information on the internet, which is not what you'll have access to do during the actual test. So when you actually try to take a practice test to see what sections you need to work on, try to simulate the exact same environment you will be in when you take the test. So close your doors, like put your electronics away, actually sit at a desk like upright like you will. Try to simulate all those different factors, because that will basically put you in the exact same environment as you'll be when you actually take the test, and thus your scores will be more realistic. Then after you take that exam, score yourself and score all the individual sections too. And the ACT and the SAT outline how exactly they get scored and how you should take your practice test and score them to see what the different section scores you got were, but then what the combined score you got is as well. And then based on that score and the subsection scores, work on the sections that you can improve the most on. So for instance, with the SAT, where each section has a maximum of 800 points for a combined of 1,600, if you got a 790 on the math portion, but you got, let's say, a 720 on the reading writing portion, you would want to work on the reading writing portion instead of the math portion. Because when it gets to the difference between 10 points on the SAT or 1 point on the ACT, it could just be a couple of questions that you got wrong. That would put you a couple marks away from a perfect score. So work on the sections that you can improve the most on. So the question that I get so often from students that I work with through CollegeAdvisor is, how do these standardized tests actually impact my college applications to universities? And there isn't necessarily a golden answer, because different admissions committees at different universities, both different levels of eliteness and, like in the same category of eliteness, different universities really weigh the SAT or the ACT differently. So it really has a different impact depending on what college you're talking about. But it is something that you do want to focus on, because it's something that if you really nail, can actually get you a lot more benefit than it can put you at a disadvantage. So it wouldn't necessarily put you too much at a disadvantage for the most part, but it can really get you a lot of benefits. For instance, it could automatically qualify you for a lot of different merit-based scholarships at universities. They don't oftentimes tell you about this, but there are sometimes merit scholarships available to anybody who has a combined SAT score of over 1,400. They'll get an automatic $8,000 per year. And with the cost of college in America being really, really high than most any other country in the whole world, those scholarships will come in handy to affording your education. Sometimes it also depends on the major that you're applying for. For instance, if you are applying for an engineering major, sometimes they might not necessarily be focusing as much on the reading writing portion, but they would more so be focusing on the math and science portions of your score, at which point they would look at your subsections and the scores you got on those. But on the other hand, maybe if you're applying for an English degree or a pre-law degree or a literature degree, they might focus more on the reading writing section and less on the math section. So it could depend on the major you apply for. And then there are also different schools view it in different ways. Some universities have actually been very bold and stated, we will not consider SAT or ACT scores because we don't think they're indicative to us at how students will perform at our school and whether they can be successful as a college student here or not. Other universities will say you must submit your SAT or ACT score, otherwise else we can't consider your application for admission. And other universities make it optional. Like if you want to submit it, you can and they'll consider it. But if you don't want to, you don't have to. But the biggest thing to take away is that the SAT and the ACT is not the sole deterministic factor of whether you will get into college or not. There are so many other different things that actually impact the admissions results that you get. And SAT and ACT scores, if the college does even consider them, is only one of several other things that admissions officers actually care about. So if you don't necessarily have the highest score, if you don't have a perfect SAT or ACT score, don't worry at all. I didn't have a perfect SAT score. And many people that I know at my university did not have a perfect SAT or ACT score. So try to do the best that you can if your colleges that you're applying to require them, but don't worry too much about it. So you might be wondering, what exactly is a good score on the SAT? So if I want to be considered for merit scholarships, if I want to be really competitive at those elite schools that do require the ACT or the SAT. So in sort of from the eyes of CollegeAdvisor, what we always recommend to our students for elite schools, like MIT or Ivy Leagues or Stanford University, you want to, on the ACT, have a combined score of 35 or 36. And you want to do really well on the sections that pertain the most to your majors. So for instance, if you're going for an engineering major, you really want to have your science and your math section be as high as they can. But overall, you want to aim to get a 35 or 36 on the ACT overall. And then for the SAT, between 1,500 and 1,600. For merit scholarships at other universities, generally speaking, what I tend to see is that students that have a combined ACT score between 34 and 36, or combined SAT score between 1,400 and 1,600, oftentimes do get qualified for those automatic merit scholarships that get released to any student who has a score above a certain threshold. Typically, those thresholds are 34 on the ACT or 1,400 on the SAT. So if their merit scholarships are something that would be beneficial to your family, then definitely consider that as well. And then also, as I mentioned before, certain schools or certain majors might only care about seeing high scores in certain sections. For instance, engineering majors, typically, obviously they don't want to see a super bad score in reading or writing, but typically they want to see strong scores in the math and science sections. And then as far as like how, if you take the test officially, like you register and pay for the test, and you officially take it and get your score back, you might be wondering, is this score good enough? If there's room to improve, generally speaking, if you are within the 750 to 800 range, that is deemed a good score for that specific section of the SAT, or again, 35 to 36 for the ACT for any specific section. But if you do want to try and really nail the SAT or nail the ACT or get better, I always recommend that my students take the test 3 to 4 different times. And when I say the test, I mean the same test. Either decide that you want to do the SAT or the ACT. Don't sort of bother your mind with both, because they're formatted differently and you'll get used to different types of questions depending on what exam you take. But take it 3 to 4 times. And what I usually see from my students is that after 3 to 4 times, your score kind of plateaus. So it doesn't necessarily improve as much after the 3rd or the 4th time. So that's my general recommendation of how many times you should try to improve your score, because it also costs a lot of money. So if you have a score within the 35 or 36, or between 750 and 800 for a section on the SAT already, then I would say that's totally fine, because that really puts you at a competitive spot for elite universities and merit scholarships. All right, so that is basically all that I have as far as giving you an overview of what the SAT and the ACT is. Again, I mentioned that I'm a senior advisor at CollegeAdvisor, and if you were to, when you're applying to colleges, if you want support and assistance with someone like myself, helping you through all of your different components of the application, which are essays, SAT and ACT exams, interviews. You are encouraged to reach out to collegeadvisor.com. If you want, we have a starter plan for $49 per month. That would give you 1 hour per month of private advising. We also have scholar plans that are $99 per month and give you 2 hours a month. Or we have other subscription plans that are higher and give you access to more hours with advisors and more offline essay editing services as well. So if you're interested, they're going to, NHSS is going to post a link in the chat right now for you guys to use. So go through that link if you guys want to join. But if you want to work with somebody like myself, an advisor that has a lot of experience helping students really get into their dream colleges, I'd encourage you to check us out on collegeadvisor.com. All right, so at this point, we are going to transition over to live Q&A. I usually like to reserve the majority of my webinars for Q&A because I find that that can actually be more helpful to students to answer your questions instead of having me just ramble on information to you guys. So at this point, if you guys do have any questions, I already see a couple of them posted in the Q&A here. I will answer those questions, so feel free to post them in the Q&A if you haven't already. All right, let's see here. So, all right, awesome. So the first question is, can you superscore by separating reading from one test and writing from another test, or do these two stay together since they're both out of 800? So reading and writing on the SAT, the reading and the grammar part, reading comprehension and grammar, those are one score that you get. That's one subscore, so they do combine it. So unfortunately, you can't take your reading comprehension score from one exam and your writing score / grammar score from another one. But what you can do is, let's say if you do better on the math section from your January SAT and you do better on your reading section from your June SAT, what you can submit to colleges is your best math score from the January section or from the January exam and your best reading writing combined score from the June exam. And that's what they'll actually consider when they're looking at your profile. Let's see. What does the optional essay mean? Do you choose whether or not to write the essay, or does something affect whether or not you have to write the essay? That's a good question. So on both the SAT and the ACT, what I would recommend is look at the admissions websites of the universities that you apply to. Oftentimes they say whether or not they require the essay from the SAT or the ACT. And basically, if you are applying to any school, or if you think you might apply to any school that requires the essay, I always recommend to do it. But if a college does not require the essay, that means that when you are registering with the ACT organization or with College Board for the SAT, you can choose whether or not you will basically sit in the 5th section of the exam for the essay, or whether you will leave after the 4th section. So you will choose whether or not you actually want to do the essay. But refer to whether colleges require it or not, because some colleges might not consider your application if they don't see an essay. So they have all that information on their admission site. And if you were to be working with one of the advisors at CollegeAdvisor, we would help lay out the requirements for each college that you want to apply to. All right, is it better to do the optional essay, or does it not matter? Also, which test is more useful to take? As far as the first question, is it better to do the optional essay? If you are going to have a school possibly in your college list that you end up applying with that requires the essay, I'd say do it because it's better to be safe than sorry. And then as far as which test is more useful to take, I would say there really isn't any difference between how an admissions committee looks at the SAT versus the ACT. It's not like if you submit a perfect score that they would prefer one over the other. They just want to see good scores if they do take it into account with their admissions decisions. Should students plan to take both tests? I would recommend taking a practice exam for the ACT and a practice exam for the SAT. And then depending on which one you do better on, in the first practice exam, again, simulate that environment that you would be in the real testing center. But depending on whichever one you do better on, that's the one that I would focus on, and only focus on one of them, because the testing formats really are very different. So I would recommend focusing on one of them and trying to nail one of them. Let's see. Do you know the difference between the SAT Blue Book and the Black Book? I've not heard of the SAT Black Book. The SAT Blue Book is the official College Board book that has all the practice exams from the official designers of the SAT. So the people who make the actual exams that you take when you sit for them at your high school, they are the ones who wrote the Blue Book every single year. So that's what I would recommend going with. The Black Book might be the color of a different brand of practice exams. For instance, the Princeton Review is one brand, Kaplan is another. There are a lot of other brands too. But I would always recommend going with the Blue Book for SAT. When should I begin to prepare for the SAT and ACT, specifically in high school? That's a good question. I always recommend that my students sit for their first real SAT or ACT and have it serve as a baseline at the end of their freshman year or the beginning of their sophomore year. And that way you know what sections you'll need to work on. Because if you end up knowing all the information for the math section, let's say, and you score really well, again, in that 750 to 800 range or 35 to 36 for the ACT, then I always like to tell my students, that's great. Now you don't need to focus on the math section. You can only focus on the reading, writing section or the science section of the ACT, depending on what your scores are. So I recommend end of freshman year or beginning of sophomore year, sit for your first exam. This is a good question. Do you know the rough number of questions on the test? So the questions are all multiple choice. And basically what happens is there are specific sections and you fill out your bubble sheet, and that's how they grade it, is they just put the bubble sheet through the machine. But basically the number of questions changes each year. I didn't take the SAT, so I'm not familiar with how long that is. But on the, or I didn't take the ACT, sorry, so I'm not familiar with that. But on the SAT, it was approximately like 20 to 25 different questions per section. And then on the Math 2 section, like on the with calculator section, it was a couple less questions. But that's approximately what I remember. But if you actually take a practice exam from the real organization, you will get the accurate impression of how many questions there actually are. And it's standard. Like on one exam, they aren't gonna, like between the January sitting and the February sitting, they're not gonna change the number of questions that are there. If they did, they would have to tell the whole nation that they're changing their exam. And that would be something you'd hear about through your advisor or through your guidance counselor. What years can high school students take the exam? Any years. You can even sign up for it in middle school if you want. Do you have to answer all the questions in all the sections? No, you do not have to answer them. This really dates back to the previous version of the SAT, which currently isn't the way it works, but you used to actually get points taken off for incorrect answers, but they no longer do that. So there used to be a strategy about if you aren't really confident in your answer, don't answer it. But I always recommend to students, even though you don't have to answer all the questions, guess. Because if you happen to guess the right answer, then that's more points for you, which is great. What is the least perfect score for the SAT and the ACT that gets somebody into good colleges? That's not necessarily something that is standard. Again, it depends on what college you're applying to, and it depends on what major that you're applying to. I know of people who have been in the 31s and the 32s for specific sections of the SAT who got into like fairly target schools, like Boston University, Boston College, Northeastern in the Boston area. They didn't get into MIT or Harvard or those elite schools. But basically on the SAT, I know people that had scores in like the sub scores in the 600, like the high 600 range too, who got in. But again, it was the subsection that wasn't related to their major. So there isn't necessarily a standard like score that people, like a low score that people got in with. But my recommendation is try your best on the exam and talk with your advisor or your guidance counselor about what schools are appropriate for you given your grades and your SAT and ACT scores. Okay, if you take one of the tests 3 to 4 times, do schools just see the best score or all of them? Good question. They see the 2 scores. You have the option to submit just the scores from one test if you don't want to super score them. But if you super score them, you send them both tests that have, or in the case of the ACT, all 3 tests that have the best scores. So they do see them, but they do, I assure you, they do not consider the fact that you've submitted 3 or 2 different tests to superscore. They actually just have an admissions assistant who goes through the numbers, or they might even have software do it at that point that calculates what your superscore is, and that's what they print out and actually evaluate when they're looking at your application. Can you still apply for the scholarship if you don't meet the qualified score? If you're talking about the automatic scholarships that you automatically qualify for given certain scores, no, you wouldn't be able to apply to those in most cases. Sometimes there are applications that you can submit to be considered for more merit scholarships, especially before you've committed to a college, because it's kind of like a negotiation point that you can use. But those automatic qualification scholarships are based off of your SAT scores and your GPAs. And if you don't meet them, then you don't meet the requirements that the alumni stated. And the university does have to follow the instructions provided by the alumni that actually donated the money that's funding that scholarship. Let's see. How early? We already answered that question. What is your best advice to do good when you take the SAT and ACT? Practice as much as possible. Really focus on the sections that, according to the practice exams that you took, the sections that can be improved the most. And then also make sure to get a good night's sleep before the exam, be hydrated, eat breakfast the morning of the exam, all those normal things that work with your final exams and your AP exams. That's my recommendation. Let's see. How does the optional essay affect your scoring? So as far as the optional essay score, it is a separate score that you'd be submitting to colleges. So if you did submit the essay, they'd see the subscores of the math and the reading writing for the SAT, or the math, reading, writing, and science for the ACT. And then separately, they'd see your essay scores. When is the test? If you go online to collegeboard.org or to the ACT's organization website, you'll be able to see the dates for your test. There are a lot of different centers that you can take it at as well. How do you know which test is best for me? Good question. This depends on the practice exams that you take. So what I recommend is do one full practice exam of the ACT, one full practice exam of the SAT, and then whichever one you scored better in, concentrate on that one. Let's see. Do the questions have specific things for you to practice? So I'm imagining that that's like specific areas of math or specific rules of grammar. If you go to the official book by the ACT.org and the Blue Book from College Board, they will have all the information on what the actual content that they test is. Let's see, how many times can you take the test? Can you take it more than 4 times, or will it look bad on college applications? You can take it as many times as you want, but each time you take the test costs more money. Like you have to pay when you register to take the test, and you have to like bring a confirmation email with you to the test center. Otherwise, else they won't let you take the test. But basically, you can take it as many times as you want. But what I've seen with historically when working with students is that after that 3rd or 4th time, they don't improve their scores. So it's a waste of money at that point. So I'm not going to be able to provide any insight on specific scores that you received. So any questions about like, I got this on the test, is that a good score? That's something that you can talk with your guidance counselor or with an admissions advisor if you were to join with CollegeAdvisor about. Do international colleges need ACT or SAT scores? So generally speaking, no. They have their own admissions exams that you would be sitting for or taking remotely, but all that information would be conveyed on their admissions website or during one of their information sessions. Let's see. Which test do you think would have a bigger impact for college admissions? Both of them. Like it doesn't really differ. They don't favor one over the other. They just want to see a good score in general. Let's see, some of these questions I've already answered, so I'm going to skip through them. This is also recorded, by the way, so you'll be able to rewatch this as well. Do they combine the scores automatically for the SAT? No, they don't. You have to make sure to submit both tests that have the highest sub scores of the different sections to be able to have the admissions officers actually consider that, because usually what you end up doing is on the application that you submit, you end up denoting your scores of the subsections that you got, and then they want you to submit the official score from College Board to them via their college university code. That's usually 4 digits with College Board. And that way they receive the official scores and they just use that to verify the scores that you got. Okay, what's the best strategy for the reading section? Read questions first or passage first? I'd say read the questions first, because then you know what information you want to be looking at. Let's see. When trying to get into a 7 or 8 year medical program, what would a good score range on the SAT be? Medical programs, I'd recommend concentrating on the math section for that, but you could ask an admissions officer at the college that you're going to, because it might be different for separate programs. I myself am not a medical student or pre-med. I did computer science, so I'm not exactly sure. Let's see. There are a lot of repeat questions here. So, can colleges ask for both? I have never heard of any college that requires both the ACT and the SAT. If they do, that's probably a big turnoff for a lot of applicants, and colleges generally want to attract the best applicants that they can. Let's see. Does the SAT still offer essays? To my knowledge, yes, they do, but it's optional, so it's not required. With the old SAT, that was out of 2,400. It used to be required, and it used to go into that 2,400 score, but now it's optional. Let's see. Should you apply to college as soon as the date opens if the SAT is waived? If the SAT is waived, definitely consider applying, because that means that they aren't necessarily going to be strongly considering the SAT. Consider whether they are making it optional, though, because if you have a strong SAT or ACT score and it's optional, that really can put you at an advantage. Here's a good question. If you cannot afford any books or something like that to study, what else is the best way to study? That's a good question. There are some free resources that College Board and the ACT organization provides. But in that case, I would always recommend going to your guidance counselor and seeing if they might have a copy of a blue book or the ACT official practice test. And then also when it comes to actually registering for the ACT or registering for the SAT, they oftentimes have waivers for the fees it costs to register for them if you are from a low-income family. So all you have to do is apply through College Board. And if your family income is under a certain amount, they'll waive all the fees, so it won't cost anything to send your scores or to register. Let's see. What are the subjects in the SAT and the ACT, and how are they different? So the subjects, again, as I said in the beginning, are the reading, writing is grammar focused. Math for the SAT has 2 different parts, with calculator and without calculator. And for ACT, there's just 1 math section. And then the ACT, but not the SAT, has a science section as well. And they're different because of the content that they test. How long is the SAT from start to finish? So this might have changed from when I took it, but for us, each section was either a 55-minute section or a 25-minute section. So I don't remember off the top of my head how long it was, but it, generally speaking, was around 3 hours in total. Are the questions the same when you retake the exams? No. They make a new exam every time they offer it. So they make 1 batch of February exams, 1 batch of March exams, 1 batch of April exams, etc. So you will have different questions. They will be testing the same skills, for instance, algebra on the math section, trig on the math section, reading comprehension, grammar rules, and stuff like that. But they will have different questions, because otherwise else you could just like do trial and error and try to memorize all the answers. What's the best way to study for the SAT, especially if you choose to do so without extra programs and do so alone? It's a good question. Basically, when it comes to studying for the SAT, simulate the environment as much as possible. So study in your room, electronics off, and really try to focus on the questions that you got right and wrong. When you grade your practice exams, they will tell you what topics they were testing. So for instance, in the math section, if you find yourself always in the low 700s on the math SAT, you might find that it's always the geometry questions that are difficult for you, or it's always the heart of algebra, or whatever the topic is, and study those specific topics. Same thing with reading comprehension. Reading comprehension, there are specific things that they ask for, and different types of questions, like what was the author's purpose, or what did this word mean? So to be testing vocabulary, or why was this character upset at that character, or something like that. So they ask different types of questions to have you infer and reason different things about the passage you read. And grammar as well. There are separate grammar rules that you are learning all the time in school, so they test different things like that. So study those specific topics that you actually are struggling with. And that is the exact thing that an SAT tutor or a program that prepares you for the SAT or ACT would take you through, is they try to pinpoint what types of questions are confusing, and let's try to clarify that confusion so you can nail them. Is it too late for someone who will be a senior in the fall to take the SAT or the ACT? Nope, not too late. What you can do is you can actually, so there are 2 rounds of admissions applications. There are early action and early decision, which typically happen in November or sometimes December. And then there's regular admissions, which is in January or sometimes even February. And what you can do is, if you are going to be taking a test after the application deadline date, but you'll get your score before the decision date for that period of time. So oftentimes early action and early decision comes out in the middle of December, and then regular action decisions come out from in March and April. So if you'll get your score before they actually make their decision, you can include that score, but you have to automatically send it to them. So when you register, you need to automatically tell College Board, send my score, and then they'll prioritize your grading over other people's grading. But they'll still get the scores out by the deadline that they say they will. They'll just send it to the college as soon as they know your score, instead of you having to do it yourself. But no, it's not too late for seniors to take it. And again, if you're going to a school that requires it, or that would qualify you for automatic merit scholarships, I'd encourage you to do it. Let's see. Here's a good question. What's the difference between test blind and test optional? So test blind is that type of college that I was talking about, where they will not look at your scores. Even if you submit a perfect score to them, they're going to pretend you never submitted to them, because they are not going to care at all about the SAT, and they believe that it puts students at a disadvantage, depending on what scores they have, and they really don't think it actually matters when they determine who's a good student and who's a good fit for their university. Versus test optional is saying that we understand that there are extreme circumstances with COVID and the pandemic that have been happening, or we understand that you might not necessarily want to take the SAT. We'll still consider your application if you don't take the SAT or the ACT, but if you do want to submit your scores to us, we will consider them. So the test optional schools are the ones where you'd really want to submit those scores that are really, really good. And depending on the school that you're applying to, and whether it's a safety target or reach school, your guidance counselor or your admissions advisor through CollegeAdvisor would be able to help you with that. But test optional means they will consider it if you want them to. Test blind means they won't consider it even if you do want them to. Hopefully that makes sense. Is the PSAT just like a prep test, or should you take the SAT as it is? So PSAT is a different category of tests, which is, it stands for pre-SAT. And basically what it is it's a way to qualify for national merit scholarship. And then also sometimes colleges will use your PSAT score and they will get automatic access to them, and they'll use that to kind of advertise their colleges to you. So if you take the PSAT and you put your email on there, you might start getting a lot of emails from your local universities or other universities saying, hey, so-and-so, we recommend that you apply to our university. Check out what this student has to say about our engineering major, or something like that. Basically a bunch of advertisements for colleges. But that's always a good indication that they're interested in having you apply. because if they're interested in you applying, then there's a better chance that you'll get admitted if you do like that school and end up applying to it. So PSAT, you don't worry about it. It doesn't get used in official admissions decisions at all, but it is a good sense of how you are doing preparing for the SAT, and it can qualify you for National Merit Scholarship too. What scores would be needed to get into less elite schools? That's a very generic question, but what I always recommend is talk to your guidance counselor or your admissions advisor about that, but also look on their admissions page. They usually have a profile about what the previous year's class of admitted students had, like their stats as far as like standardized test scores, GPAs, number of APs, number of awards, stuff like that. So you can look at those average stats and see where you fall within them. What warrants a school to be considered elite? That's a good question. Generally, when we're talking about elite schools, we're talking about schools that have a very, very low admissions rate. So admissions rates in the single digits is what we usually consider elite, because that usually means that they have a lot of different programs that they offer that are very, very attractive to students and lead them to the best jobs and the best opportunities to take advantage of as a student. So a lot of people want to apply there, but they don't have as many spots as people that apply. So the admissions rates are lower. That's what we consider an elite school with single digit admit rates. Is the PSAT an effective tool in assisting you for preparing for the SAT? Yes, it is. Let's see. How do they pick people for scholarships based on their scores? If it's those automatic merit scholarships, anybody with scores that meet the threshold that the alumni dictated will get that scholarship. So theoretically, that means that they can support every single student being admitted to that college, deciding to accept that offer of admission and enrolling, and every student would be able to get that much scholarship from them. So they always do a worst case estimate. Let's see. A lot of these questions are repeat questions, so I'm going through the new ones. There's one question that says, what if you do really bad after 4 times? If you haven't necessarily gotten a good score or a good combined super score after taking it 4 different times, then I would recommend that to be a question for your either admissions advisor through CollegeAdvisor or your guidance counselor. And you'd want to step back and take a look at the schools that you're applying to. There's actually going to be another webinar coming up in August about how to form your college list and how to decide where am I going to apply to colleges based on my stats and based on what I'm interested in. So really take a look at that list and see whether based on those scores and whether the schools are test blind, test optional, or test required, really consider whether or not they're going to be within reach, within target, or a safety school for you. Are AP exam scores counted in a similar way to the ACT and the SAT? Are they worth as much as the ACT or the SAT? This is a good question. So AP scores are different. They are really meant to show how well you mastered a topic in school that was required for you to get your high school diploma. And AP scores not only are really sort of go hand in hand with the grades that you get in your classes, because they show how well you mastered a concept taught in school. But if you get certain scores, depending on your university, AP exams, usually of scores 3, 4, or 5, depending on the university, can actually give you credit for that corresponding intro class in college. So for instance, at MIT, if you have a 5 in AP Calculus BC, you can be exempt from our first 2 calculus classes that are at our university. So they can oftentimes save money in the long run if you can avoid some of those general education requirements and start taking your electives. So someone was told that if you take the test a certain number of times, schools will just start averaging the scores instead of taking the best. That is not true. They will only see the scores that you submit to them. So with the scores that are submitted to them, they will be basically, most of them have an automated script, like software script, that pulls the scores from College Board and actually combines and finds the best subscore and actually prints out your profile that way. but I have not heard of any school that averages the scores. Let's see. What if you have a date to take the exam and you didn't go? That is unfortunate. Like if you decided that you aren't going to need the SAT and the ACT, even after you registered for it, see if you can try to get a refund. Sometimes there's a process by a certain date that you can get a refund for signing up. But in that case, then just make sure not to sign up for future exams either. Oftentimes there might be makeup dates as well, depending on your school and your situation too. So if you missed it because you were sick or something like that, then that might be an option, but generally try to attend the exams if you register for them. Let's see. Is there a specific time period you have to wait between taking the test? Like, could I sign up for the August test and the October test, or do I have to wait a school year? You can sign up for tests at any frequency that you want. The only thing I always recommend to my students is wait to receive your score back from your test, which oftentimes takes like 2 to 3 months after you sit for the exam, because then you'll know how you did on each of the specific sections. And you'll know which sections you have to prepare for more and which sections you might want to retake. Or in the case that you do really well, you might find, I actually am satisfied with submitting this score with my applications, and you won't need to pay additional money and register again. How do you send scores to the individual colleges? Good question. So each college has a code that they use, and on College Board's website and the ACT website, you're able to put in that college code, and they take care of sending the actual score to the college for you. You don't need to mail it or anything like that. Let's see. Why is there 2 tests and not just one? Good question. Probably just competitive market, because a lot of colleges are still using this, so there's a lot of demand for it. How will they know that we want our test to be super scored if we submit more than one? They will see all the scores that you submit to them, whether that is all of the tests you ever took, or whether that's just 2 or 3 that you want super scored. And what they do is they look at all of those tests and they see what were your highest subsection scores, and they pick those subsection scores themselves, because basically an admissions officer or like a software script recognizes it and automatically pulls it that way. Is the SAT or the ACT more popular to take? That depends on the major that you're applying for. I know in engineering, it's fairly popular for the ACT to be taken, but I also know plenty of people who have taken the SAT. But it depends on what major you're going for, because the tests are formatted differently and they ask different types of questions. What's the benefits for sophomores to start with the SAT? Does the score of the SAT at this stage count for anything? So the score of the SAT at this stage won't necessarily count for anything. It's the PSAT that will get you access to national merit scholarships. But taking the SAT at this age is generally a good strategy to see where you are and what you need to focus on. Because if you want to get into elite schools and you take your first SAT exam and you don't get very good scores, then you still have a lot of time throughout your whole sophomore year, your whole junior year, and the beginning of your senior year to take the exams again and really improve your scores. So that's the benefit of taking the SAT or the ACT early for your first score, and then trying to improve based off of that. Let's see. Do you recommend high school students take AP classes / tests? Yes. If your high school offers them, take the APs, because they'll be giving you an advantage in the college admissions process, because A, you'll be doing challenging coursework, B, getting really good grades in them show that you are ready for college level work. And then also, if you score well on the APs, they can give you college credit and save you money. What can you do to help with the math skills on the sections that require no calculator? I would say really try to get in the habit of writing problems out and doing math on paper. For instance, practice doing like multiplication problems out and doing it on paper and like carrying all the digits and adding the zeros and stuff like that. And once you're able to write it out on paper, that can be your strategy. It might take a little bit more time than if you had a calculator, but it still can lead you to the correct answer. Let's see. How long do you have to wait to retake the test? I already went through this. You don't have to wait any period of time. I always just recommend to my students to wait until you know your scores. Because let's say if you got a perfect score, then you wouldn't need to sign up again and waste that money. But if you get your score back, you'll be able to know which sections you want to study more and which sections you really want to concentrate on. Let's see. So does the Blue Book from College Board have reviews or just mock tests? The Blue Book has the strategy behind the SAT. So it goes over all the different types of questions that they ask and the difficulty level associated with them. And then it also has, I think, 4 to 5 different full practice tests that you should just sit through. And again, simulate the environment as best as you can. How do you know if the school that you're applying to is test blind? Ask the admissions officers in an information session where they go over admissions requirements, or look on their website. They usually have something on their website that says, for this year, we are test blind, or we are test blind in general, or something like that. We'll have all that information on the website. Here's a good question. So why would you register and have scores sent to schools when you don't know what your score will be at the time you register? Wouldn't you want to wait and see how you did and perhaps want to take it again at another sitting? The only time you would register to have your scores immediately sent to the school would be if you are taking the test after you submitted your application. So that usually works for cases where you're taking the test in November and you submitted an early action or early decision application on November 1st. Then you want to, as soon as your test is graded, have the score sent off to the colleges. And yeah, there is a risk, right? If you don't do well on the test, then admissions officers will get that score. But then again, I trust the process that if they have an automated software script, it's not going to update your profile if the scores aren't better at all. And if you do score really well on a section, you will be getting the benefit of having admissions officers know your most recent score and see that A, you've improved your testing, and that B, that the combined score that you got when your sections were super scored is actually going to be the number they're going to be considering, whether they admit, defer, or reject. Are the SAT and the ACT the same difficulty? That depends on your learning style and your test taking style. So for me, I found the SAT to be way easier than the ACT, but I also know of other people who found it the opposite way around. So that's why I always recommend students try out each exam, take a practice exam of the ACT and a practice exam of the SAT. And then based off of that and how you score, go with one of them that you either think was easiest or really that you score the best. Because usually your scores are pretty indicative of which test you thought was easier. When do you take the PSAT? The PSAT happens in sophomore year for some schools, or mostly junior year in the fall, like October. Let's see. So I see a lot of questions about general admissions questions regarding your college application strategy. This is stuff that I would recommend that you ask to your guidance counselor, or again, if you want to move forward with working with an advisor with CollegeAdvisor, feel free to contact us. And once you sign up to work with us, that would be a question to ask your advisor from CollegeAdvisor. So would I be more prepared if I study for the SAT this summer and submit my scores immediately before the deadline? I remember, take practice exams. After you practice certain sections, take a full practice exam again, see if your score increased. Because if it increased, that's a good sign that you've learned something and that you'll be doing better on the real exam when it comes time. Again, make sure to get sleep the night before, be fully hydrated, eat before your exam as well, all those normal strategies for any test taking environment. But if you practice over the summer, then my recommendation is to sit for the SAT again, or the ACT, and see how you do. It's just depending on when you take it, you might want to immediately submit the scores to your colleges, or you might want to wait and not submit them quite yet. Can you get a merit scholarship in any college that is optional or blind for the SAT or ACT? That is something that you would have to go through with the admissions officers and ask them about that. They know what scholarships are available to students who get who are having certain parts of their profile stand out in certain ways. For instance, there might be a scholarship that has a very vague requirement by the alumni that says, I want this scholarship to go to someone who is a promising future engineer, right? There are so many different ways that admissions officers could interpret that. So they'll have more leeway with those types of scholarships. But if it is a test optional or test blind, they probably don't have the automatic scholarships that come from your SAT or ACT score, because either they don't take the scores, or that would be putting certain students at a certain advantage, which wouldn't be fair. Let's see. Here's a good question. So if somebody has test anxiety, what would be the best way to control it? So when it comes to test anxiety, the key to overcoming it is to simulate yourself in the environment on a normal basis, because then your mind gets used to it. Anxiety is normally caused by a fear of something, like a fear of not doing well on the test. So if you've practiced a lot and you've noticed that you're doing well when you grade yourself, then that usually helps the test anxiety. But again, if you are, let's say, doing a practice test online without with access to the internet, and your phone goes off and you have a Facebook notification every 2 minutes or something like that, that's not going to be at all like the room where you actually take your ACT or your SAT. So you aren't going to be sort of training your brain to work in that type of environment yet, and that can lead to test anxiety. But then also one thing too is sometimes people are stressed out about the impact that your test scores will have on your admissions to the colleges you want to go to. That's something, again, to talk with your admissions advisor or your guidance counselor about, because if you do have test anxiety, and there are several different schools that have great programs for the major that you're interested in, maybe applying to the schools that are test optional or test blind might be the better way to go because of that. So talk to your advisor and talk to your guidance counselor about that. But practicing and simulating the environment that you actually take the test in is the best way to avoid that. Let's see. Are there practice exams online? Are they free? Yes, there are practice exams online, but they are produced by third parties. So they're usually third parties who did purchase the blue book, and they made different questions based off of that blue book that are very similar. But if all of a sudden College Board or the ACT organization decides that we're going to change the way we ask our math questions, that third-party website might not be as up to date as the actual blue book or the College Board or the ACT organization practice test. So I always recommend go to the ground source of truth, the organizations that actually get the money and make the tests themselves. All right, so we have time for 1 to 2 more questions here. Let's see. Where do we sign up for the practice test? So signing up for the practice test is something you might be able to do if you're using like an SAT tutor. They might offer practice tests where they take something from the blue book or the official source and give access to you and, again, simulate that environment. But normally you would just have to simulate that environment yourself, like put away all your electronics, clear off your desk, get the blue book in front of you, time yourself with a timer that's not your phone because it won't be distracting. And then, or ask your parents, tell me when 55 minutes is up, tell me when 25 minutes is up, and then grade yourself. So in that case, you don't have to sign up, you just have to have access to a blue book to be able to practice. Cool. All right, so last time for one more question here. Let's see, do you see a significant difference between a prep class and Khan Academy for preparation? So I can't necessarily comment on that, but I would say try out all the different options, right? Try out Khan Academy, see how it makes you see how it changes your scores when you take the next practice test. Try out a different prep class, see how that changes. A lot of times different prep classes offer that they aren't going to get their money unless you improve your scores. That's often a common thing to look for too. But try it out and see for yourself. Awesome. So we are out of time at this point, but again, I want to thank everybody for coming to this webinar. It was great meeting all of you and telling you guys about what you can do to really improve your SAT and your ACT scores and how those impact the admission cycle for college admissions in the US. Again, we are through a CollegeAdvisor, so if you are curious what it's like to work with one of our advisors, or you're curious to start that journey of working with one of our advisors here at CollegeAdvisor, feel free to use the link that Grace sent out in the chat, and you will be connected with somebody who can tell you what the process is to sign up with one of our advisors here at CollegeAdvisor, and you'll get access to someone just like myself who can help you plan out your colleges, plan out your SAT and ACT exams, plan out the activities that you're doing, and ultimately help you submit your college application to the college of your dreams. But thank you again so much for joining us, and have a great night, everybody.